Well, what exactly is the Paris Agreement? CCTV's Robert Nagila breaks it down for us.
The Paris Agreement is a climate deal that was reached in 2015. More than 190 countries agreed to cut greenhouse gas emissions to curb global warming. Enough countries have now formally ratified the agreement for it to officially come into effect. To enter force, the deal had to be signed by 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions. Now, both China and the United States ratified the agreement. Between them, the two countries are responsible for almost 40% of global carbon emissions. Brazil and India have both ratified the agreement, along with several smaller nations. The European Union as a bloc has ratified the agreement too, but only 7 countries have done so individually. That includes the EU's 2 top emitters, France and Germany. The EU as a whole produces just over 12% of global emissions. Several other big emitters still need to ratify the agreement. But essentially, enough countries have done so for the deal to come into force. The challenge now will be implementing it and getting those carbon emissions down. Any further implementation of the deal will likely be discussed at the COP summit in Morocco. Back to you.
Thank you, Robert. Now, climate change is often linked to the causes of food insecurity in Africa. Many countries in Eastern and Southern Africa are still reeling from the negative impact of the El Niño weather phenomenon, which led to prolonged dry spells. Kenya has recently joined the list of nations battling drought. 2 days ago, the government announced that as many as 1.3 million people are facing food insecurity, water shortage, and in some cases, livestock deaths due to poor rainfall. Let's discuss this further with Dr. James Nyoro, a food security and climate change expert who has previously advised Kenya's presidency on climate change. Dr. Nyoro, it's a pleasure to have you here in studio.
Thank you. Thank you.
In your view, how significant a factor is climate change in contributing towards challenges of food insecurity across the continent?
Oh, hugely, hugely significant. You've been following what has been happening in Southern Africa. For the first time, South Africa itself had to import food. And countries such as DRC, where large-scale South African farmers have been farming, were actually sending food to South Africa. That's unheard of for a long time. I think it's almost clear that the impact of climate change is now with us, mainly because you are talking about increased droughts, increased frequency of droughts, and also the magnitude of the droughts, which means that the growing season is affected. If, for instance, what we are hearing is right, if short rains in Kenya do not come, it means that in areas where they plant in November, which is the eastern part of the country, they will not plant. It means they will not harvest in February. It means for that period they have to be fed. So essentially the fact that you have shorter seasons, or the drought comes and there is no water at all, or that food availability then is minimized. There are issues to do with irrigation. Okay, irrigation is one way of mitigating or adapting to climate change, but it means less water. If you are doing hydroelectric generation, at least this country we are lucky because we are going more green energy, geothermal, wind, solar. But if you are hydroelectric, many African countries are, then you are adversely affected, and you are talking about even storing your industrialization. So on and on and on. Infrastructure is affected. But mainly the effect is that the majority of the people who depend on agriculture, if they cannot farm, it means they cannot get a crop, they cannot get an income, they cannot go take their kids to school, and that's enhanced poverty.
So as we gear up for the COP summit in Morocco, what should African leaders seek to get out of that summit in order to boost their efforts to create a food secure continent?
Several things, and unfortunately, we as Africa do not always talk, in the same voice. The last COP in Paris came up with enhanced green climate fund. This is a fund to be made available in order mainly to fight adaptation. Mitigation is a big issue, but let's look at adaptation because that's where Africa belongs. Now, this fund makes resources available to be invested in projects, in policies, in activities that will adapt and create resilience to those households or livelihoods that are affected. Now, the process of releasing that money, first of all, how many countries have now committed to put in enough resources in the Global Climate Fund? That's one question. Africa should be able to push that more and more countries meet their obligation in meeting the Green Climate Fund. Once it's there, and like now they have allocated about $750 million, how is it allocated? How easy is it for African countries to access it? These are issues that African countries need to ask. If you touch briefly on mitigation, it's about carbon trading. How easy is it for African countries to benefit from carbon trading, which then will promote afforestation, for instance? So if we had to go agroforestry or even plant forest in Mau and so on, is there somebody, because that is going to fix carbon, is there somebody paying for that carbon, and what mechanisms are there? How easy is it? All of those are issues that African leaders and African themselves need to push as we move more and more towards the next COP.
But also moving beyond that, moving beyond, of course, the upcoming COP summit, what other solutions do African countries need to engage to create food security?
I think the first one is, first of all, if you see what has been happening, whenever there is a drought in Southern Africa, there is a good season in Eastern Africa. That has happened. 2015 was a very, very good season for Eastern African countries. I'm talking about mainly Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, and Burundi. Ethiopia was affected this year. So there was a very good season this time. That was the time when Southern African countries are suffering. Now, I will not be surprised if the next drought in Eastern Africa, Southern Africa will be having a good crop. So what are you talking about? Regional trade.
Right.
You know, if you enhance regional trade, food will be moving from areas where it is in surplus into areas where it is deficit. The other one is internal policies. You don't need the global fund to tell you that at this stage in the country, in Kenya, you need to start mobilizing food from surplus to the deficit region so that you avoid people dying. You need to know that there will be people who will require famine relief. They can't afford, even if you put maize or food into their doorstep, they still cannot afford it. So these are internal policies that will have to be consistent to ensure that food security is promoted.
Right. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. James Nyoro, with us tonight in studio.